Have you ever felt the ground shifting beneath your feet, like as if the rules governing our world are quietly rewriting themselves? It's a feeling that resonates, from boardrooms to dinner tables, and it points to a profound truth. Our reality is in constant flux. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into a book that remarkably captured this very sensation decades ago, almost as if it possessed a crystal ball. Our guide for this exploration is The New Realities, a pivotal 1989 book by the legendary Peter F. Drucker. Born in Vienna in 1909, Drucker was far more than just an economist. He was a renowned management consultant, a professor of politics, philosophy, and management, a true polymath. What makes The New Realities so extraordinary is its timing. Published just before monumental global events like the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it uncannily predicted many of the fundamental shifts that would reshape government, economics, society, and our entire worldview. Our mission today is to distill this remarkable work for you, our listener.
We want to offer a shortcut to truly understanding the seismic changes already underway in the late 20th century that continue to shape our present. It's about grasping not just what is happening, but why it profoundly matters for your world today. Okay, let's unpack this. Drucker's insights feel incredibly relevant, don't they?
They absolutely do. What's so insightful is how Drucker identifies these quiet, almost imperceptible shifts, not the headline-grabbing events, as the true turning points. He calls them divides. Think of them like invisible thresholds in history. Once we cross one, the entire social and political landscape changes, often without anyone fully realizing it at the time. The very language we use to describe our world shifts, the underlying climate is different, and suddenly what was once considered normal or even progressive becomes, obsolete. Drucker pinpointed 1873 as the first of these great divides. Why that year? Because a seemingly obscure stock exchange crash in Vienna actually signaled the dramatic end of what he called the liberal era. This had been a century-long period of laissez-faire, rooted in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations from 1776. But within just 10 years of that quiet crash, the great liberal parties across the West, which had championed free markets and individual liberty, were in full retreat. They never regained their former dominance. Almost immediately, across continental Europe, these parties fragmented, giving rise to new, profoundly anti-capitalist movements like Marxist socialists and anti-Semitic socialists. Both were fiercely hostile to free markets and what they termed bourgeois democracy.
That's a striking detail. So, a seemingly minor economic event sparked a profound ideological realignment. And Drucker gives us a surprising fact here. The first politician to actually implement a socialist program by expropriating public utilities, things like gas, electric, and streetcar companies, wasn't a Marxist at all.
Right.
It was Karl Lueger, the anti-Semitic socialist mayor of Vienna, elected in 1896. This was practical, applied socialism, predating many Marxist attempts by years.
Precisely. Before 1873, Karl Marx was, by Drucker's account, a fairly obscure figure struggling to make a living. Yet, 5 years after that Vienna crash, he transformed into a major intellectual force. Within just 2 decades, Marxist socialist parties became the largest political force in major European countries. This period also saw the birth of the welfare state. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck introduced national health and old age insurance between 1883 and 1888. Elsewhere, like Britain and Austria, stricter regulations on employers emerged, with factory inspections and safety rules. Even in the U.S., the 1880s saw the Granger Laws, the Interstate Commerce Commission, and early antitrust laws. A populist movement arose, demanding government control over Wall Street and farm prices. Drucker even notes that Lincoln, Nebraska, around 1900, followed Vienna's example by socializing its utilities.
So for a full century after 1873, government control over the economy and society became the dominant progressive cause. The debate wasn't if we should have a welfare state, but what kind, democratic or totalitarian. That's a huge foundational shift that reshaped global politics for generations.
It truly was. And then Drucker pinpoints a second major divide occurring roughly between 1965 and 1973. Events like the 1973 oil shock and President Nixon's decision in 1971 to float the dollar were statistically non-events economically. Similarly, the student rebellions of the late 1960s, while intense, didn't fundamentally alter how institutions behaved. Yet Drucker argues this period formed a divide fully comparable to 1873. If 1873 ended the liberal era, 1973 marked the end of the era where government was widely seen as the progressive cause. The doctrines and policies that emerged from the 1870s, whether liberal democratic, social democratic, Marxist, or national socialist, rapidly became ineffectual.
It's almost like a political echo. Drucker uses a fantastic analogy here. Political slogans outlive political reality. They are the smile on politics' Cheshire cat. Quote, He meant that the grand promises of the welfare state or communism, for example, largely lost their real-world political, social, or economic relevance. They could still act as brakes on action, right? But no longer provided true guidance. For instance, New Deal slogans in America might still stir election rallies, but they offer little practical guidance for governing. So what does this profound shift really mean for us today?
It means we've entered a profound terra incognita in politics, where our old maps no longer guide us. Drucker's central argument is that the pervasive belief in salvation by society, the idea that a temporal social order embodied in government can bring about a perfect society or even salvation, has fundamentally disappeared. This belief, born in the mid-1700s with thinkers like Rousseau and Bentham, and solidified by Comte and Hegel, directly spawned figures like Marx, Lenin, Hitler, and Mao. For 2 centuries, it was the dominant force in Western politics. Consider the stark pronouncements from Mikhail Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping. As long as it does not threaten the Communist Party's monopoly of power, it's socialism. Drucker saw this not as pragmatism, but as an ideology of naked power, abandoning everything communism or socialism ever stood for. While government certainly won't wither away, the notion of the Great Society, championed by Lyndon Johnson just 2 decades before Drucker wrote, would now be met with laughter. Debates have become specific, focused on cost-benefit ratios, such as whether legalizing drugs is more effective than prohibition in curbing abuse.
That's a powerful indictment of grand ideological visions. And we've seen this shift towards political pragmatism in leaders. François Mitterrand, the French socialist president, initially clung to 1930s socialist programs, yet within 180 days, the reality of capital flight forced him to reverse course. His socialist government became one of the most pro-capitalist in the West. It's fascinating because Ramsay MacDonald, a British prime minister in 1931, was derided as a traitor for similar economic pragmatism. Mitterrand, by contrast, became a hero. What does that tell us about changing public expectations?
It illustrates a fundamental change in what constitutes political success and public acceptance. John F. Kennedy, as Drucker notes, was arguably the first American president in that century who didn't even pretend to have a grand program beyond the conquest of power, yet he remains a cult figure. Lyndon Johnson, who perhaps genuinely still believed in salvation by society, saw his Great Society initiatives become bywords for failure. Drucker's analysis reveals that practically no government program enacted since the 1950s West, or communist, has been successful in its stated aims, with the British National Health Service from 1946-47 being a rare, though now crisis-ridden, exception. This has bred a profound doubt that there's ever one right answer to complex social problems, as social situations are simply too intricate. This void, created by the disappearance of the belief in salvation by society, was originally filled in the mid-1700s. Before that, salvation by faith had dominated medieval Europe. Drucker anticipated that new messianic movements might emerge to fill this latest void, but they would likely be anti-society, seeking salvation outside or through withdrawal from society.
This is where it gets truly fascinating. Drucker saw a profound shift away from grand ideological solutions, whether left or right, towards a more pragmatic, almost transactional view of government. He argued that despite rhetoric, the Reagan Revolution and Thatcher Revolution, and even Gorbachev's perestroika and Deng Xiaoping's New China actually increased the size and scope of government. Their real importance, however, lies in their abandonment of salvation by society.
Exactly.
They no longer saw government as the organ to create a perfect society, but rather as a tool to achieve specific, practical goals. Improving competitiveness, cutting union power, boosting productivity, reducing corruption. It's a fundamental shift from seeking panaceas to applying specific diagnoses and remedies.
And this shift opened a profound void. Drucker suggests fundamentalist Islam attempts to fill this, born from deep disenchantment with both the Western welfare state and communist utopias. Similarly, the resurgence of evangelical and pastoral churches in the U.S. is, in part, a reaction to the disappearance of that secular faith in salvation by society. Drucker also cautions against expecting a return to either salvation by faith as a major political force or the early 19th century laissez-faire, which ironically also promised a kind of salvation by society. He points to post-Willy Brandt political leaders like Helmut Schmidt and Helmut Kohl as examples of this new pragmatism, guiding by principles of effectiveness, efficiency, and cost-benefit analysis rather than grand ideologies.
Drucker also argued we were witnessing the end of FDR's America and its global influence. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal was remarkably successful in forging national cohesion during the 1930s crisis, becoming a global inspiration. Its impact was so profound it became the enemy, for true radicals, explaining Hitler's otherwise inexplicable war declaration against the U.S. and why the Soviet Union had to demonize the U.S. post-WWII despite American friendliness. This tradition continued through Truman and Eisenhower, who, as Drucker puts it, saw their mission as codifying the New Deal.
This American example, stressing anti-ideological interest-bloc integration, particularly under leaders like Adenauer in Germany, de Gaulle in France, and Thatcher in Britain, largely enabled Western Europe's political and social, not just economic, recovery. Old ideologically driven parties remained, but only Southern Europe's communists who clung to salvation by society continued to operate ideologically, which is why they eventually faded into near irrelevance. A crucial related point Drucker makes is the blurring of traditional social distinctions. Historically, groups like farmers, labor, and business found political unity not just in economic interests, which could be quite diverse, but in shared culture and social identification. Think of the self-respecting working man or rural society as distinct social constructs. But these distinct values and lifestyles have largely vanished. Drucker illustrates this with American livestock breeders or broiler chicken raisers who, despite being farmers, likely have very high computer literacy. Similarly, blue-collar auto workers in Detroit now have lifestyles, motorhomes, fishing cabins, same TV shows, consumer goods, vacations indistinguishable from anyone else in American society. Their status is defined by spending power, not by a distinct economic interest or a different way of life.
And this brings us to what Drucker identifies as the new majority, a completely new social type, the knowledge worker. This group doesn't fit any traditional interest group definition. They're not farmers, labor, or traditional business owners. They're employees of organizations, yet they don't see themselves as proletarians and don't feel exploited. Paradoxically, collectively, through their pension funds, they are the only true capitalists in this new economy. Many are also bosses themselves, with subordinates, but they also have bosses. They're not middle class in the traditional sense either. Drucker calls them a uniclass, highlighting that their economic and social position remains essentially unaffected whether they work for a business, a hospital, or a university. Changing a job within this uniclass is just that, a job change, not a shift in social position.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Drucker is showing us the profound consequences of society evolving beyond traditional class structures into something entirely new, driven by knowledge rather than physical labor or inherited wealth. This raises an important question. How do we define political identity or even community in such a shifting landscape? How do we build cohesion when traditional social anchors are fading? Another of Drucker's truly bold predictions from 1989 was the disintegration of the Russian Empire. He asserted it would disappear within 25 years, if not sooner, or at least transform from a European power into a predominantly Asian entity. He believed this regardless of Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika, which Drucker saw as resembling other unsuccessful revolutions from above. The Russian Empire was unique as a land-based colonial empire, resting on the subordination of numerous other nationalities.
And Drucker points out that Russianization policies under the Tsars had fueled significant resentment, a problem not new to Russia. Lenin's promise of cultural and educational autonomy to various nationalities was actually a major factor in the Bolsheviks' victory, even securing the crucial support of the Let sharpshooters.
Absolutely. Demographic shifts compounded this. The European population of Russia was aging and shrinking, forcing increasing reliance on non-Europeans, particularly Asians. Labor shortages were appearing in rural areas, and the armed forces faced a dilemma. Either draw heavily on Asian recruits, historically unreliable under Russian command, or drastically cut military forces. Drucker suggested Gorbachev's unilateral reduction of 500,000 troops in 1988 was likely a direct result of this, to avoid entrusting the defense of European satellites to Asian soldiers. Drucker drew a crucial parallel with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, another contiguous, non-national empire. There, economic development, far from appeasing nationalities, actually fueled their nationalism. As Czechs, Slovenes, Croats, and Poles grew more affluent and westernized, they became more nationalistic and demanded greater autonomy or outright independence. Even though Austria conceded far more to its nationalities than Russia ever did, the empire still disintegrated. Drucker emphasized that nationalism is fundamentally an ism of the bourgeoisie and the educated middle class, precisely the groups who are the first beneficiaries of economic growth. Similarly, British efforts in India to foster development ultimately created modern India, but also spawned the independence movement. The stark conclusion Drucker drew was that perestroika was unlikely to save the Russian Empire. As people became more westernized, affluent, mobile, and educated, they inevitably became more nationalist and resented being colonials, demanding what he termed the Japanese solution, to be westernized but under their own control.
So Drucker laid out three possible outcomes for this disintegration. First, the empire could split into distinct European and Asian parts, which might then splinter further into autonomous or independent national groups. Second, there was the possibility of Asian domination, which would almost certainly lead to constant resistance from the European minority. And third, a turbulent confederation, loosely held together by internal power struggles among the nationalities.
The implications for the United States were also profound. Drucker predicted the end of superpowers, meaning both Russia and the U.S. would cease to hold that status. There would be no central hub in world politics, making it increasingly difficult for the U.S. to conduct foreign policy based on old assumptions. Since World War I, American foreign policy had primarily focused on restoring Europe, a priority that drove decisions in WWII, the Cold War, and NATO. This European orientation was only viable because Russia, a European power, still controlled the Asian heartland. Drucker argued that America's policies and actions in Asia, from the Korean War and Vietnam to Nixon's rapprochement with China, were essentially extensions of its European strategy to contain Russia. But this approach would become inadequate once Russia ceased to be a European power controlling Asia. The toughest new reality for the U.S., in Drucker's view, would be figuring out how to conduct foreign policy when Europe was no longer the primary concern.
And this shift in global priorities brings us right into America's own backyard, as Drucker highlights North America as a new U.S. concern. Quote, historically, the U.S. had paid little attention to its neighbors, Mexico and Canada, despite the fact that relations with the giant to the south were always the primary foreign policy concern for them. But the rapid regionalization of the world economy was creating a new North America, bringing with it new opportunities and new problems. Mexico in particular was undergoing a transformation. For over a century, since Benito Juarez, Mexico's policy had singularly focused on economic independence from the U.S. But this strategy collapsed in the early 1980s due to the oil price crash, rampant government corruption, and inefficient state-owned industries.
Drucker points out that perhaps the only way out for Mexico was to abandon its century-old policy of economic independence and embrace economic integration with the United States. This was already underway with maquiladora plants along the border and factories owned by U.S. giants. From the U.S. perspective, economic integration was preferable to continuous heavy immigration from Mexico. While economically beneficial in the long run, the transition would be very challenging for overprotected Mexican companies and their workers. Culturally and politically, it would be profoundly traumatic, potentially jeopardizing Mexico's political cohesion. Drucker questioned how Mexico could survive without it, noting it was still not truly one country, with a Spanish-speaking industrial north and a largely rural Indian south. Any U.S. policy towards Mexico, he predicted, would inevitably be unpopular in both countries, whether dealing with immigration, brain drain, or the vast wage and farm price differences. Relations with Canada, America's northern neighbor, would also become increasingly important. Drucker considered the 1988 Free Trade Treaty between the two countries relatively unimportant, as their economies were already deeply integrated. Canadian businesses were becoming highly active in the U.S., correcting the traditional dominance of Canadian markets by U.S. manufacturers. The core challenge for Canada, he suggested, would be to define what does Canada mean. The negative definition of not being U.S. would become increasingly inadequate as the economies melded. The U.S.'s traditional stance of benign neglect would no longer serve either country well.
So what does this all mean for us, the average citizen, when these massive geopolitical plates are shifting and our own backyard is becoming a foreign policy hotbed? It suggests our world is more interconnected than ever, and local issues can have global ripple effects. And as these geopolitical plates shift, Drucker observes another new reality that turns conventional wisdom on its head. When arms are counterproductive, he notes that on November 15, 1988, it had been over 43 years since the last major power hostilities, tying the longest previous period of non-fighting. Yet these were hardly years of peace, citing numerous bloody conflicts globally.
Indeed. Drucker argues that arms had become counterproductive in several ways. Economically, they were a major drain, contributing to Russia's crisis, America's economic decline, and the failure of development in places like Latin America. Socially, the army, where it took power, had begun to teach the wrong things: terror, torture, and corruption. Politically, military aid, dispensed lavishly, had proven unreliable to the point of being treacherous. He quotes a Roman historian. A general who takes a subsidy will soon start looking for a higher bidder. Dependence on outside support fundamentally contradicted the military's task of ensuring independence, often resulting in the creation of enemies.
But the most striking point is Drucker's assertion of military impotence. Arms were proving ineffective militarily. They could win battles, but no longer wars. He points to the Korean War ending in a draw despite overwhelming U.S. superiority, and major powers like France, the US, China, and Russia losing to much smaller opponents in Vietnam and Afghanistan. Even Israel, after 4 wars, was no closer to victory. These generic failures, Drucker argues, demanded a generic explanation. Arms had lost their military capacity. In an age of nuclear, chemical, and bacterial weapons, they could no longer defend countries. War, in Clausewitz's famous words, was no longer the continuation of policy by other means. It had become the defeat of policy.
This profound shift, Drucker stresses, requires far more than just cutting arms. It demands a fundamental rethinking of defense and arms, a reaffirmation of government's monopoly on weapons of destruction, and a return to arms as tools of policy, not masters. He delves into how the relationship between arms and the economy had changed dramatically. For centuries up to the 17th, arms were a pure burden, contributing nothing to scientific or technological advancement. Then, from the 17th century to World War II, a 250-year period, defense and civilian economies moved in parallel, mutually enriching each other. Military technology spurred civilian advancements, and civilian innovations found immediate military applications. Production facilities were interchangeable, easily converting from civilian cars to fighter planes and back.
But Drucker declares, now this is over. Post-WWII, defense spending and technology became serious drains on the civilian economy. Japan's minimal defense spending became a major strength. In contrast, America's heavy defense burden became a primary cause of its competitive loss, and Russia's even larger burden led to its economic backwardness. The core issue wasn't just money, but people. Japan's scientists and engineers worked for the civilian economy, while in the U.S. a third of engineers were in defense. In Russia, competent scientists were drafted into defense and remained there.
This led to widespread military malperformance. Drucker cites the British in the Falklands, a logistical triumph but a military near fiasco, and the Americans in Grenada, a near disaster despite overwhelming force. The underlying reason, he suggests, is that modern technology presents an infinite number of possible military actions, yet even the mightiest country can only prepare for one kind of action. There are no central strategic concepts, only endless options. A force built for one type of enemy or warfare cannot effectively adapt to all others. Perhaps the most ominous development, Drucker notes, is the return of the private army. Governments were rapidly losing their monopoly on arms and their use, a monopoly axiomatic since the modern state arose in the 16th century. Yet, traditional defense became meaningless against threats like parcel post-nuclear weapons or biological chemical attacks, which even President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative couldn't stop. Terrorists, in effect, reinstated the private army. This marked the end of the road for the national state's core sovereignty based on national armies and defense. Drucker emphasizes this doesn't mean unilateral disarmament or pacifism. Deterrence had kept major power peace. The 1988 Reagan-Gorbachev Treaty was a crucial first step because, tacitly, both sides agreed they had a common interest in not gaining advantage and, in fact, in becoming weaker militarily. Economic necessity, he posits, might finally force major countries to significantly reduce military spending, a first in human history where economic reality might prevail over military aggrandizement. He even suggests the possibility of nations uniting against terrorism, much like 19th century nations banded together to stamp out piracy. The fundamental need, however, remains a reassessment of defense and arms altogether. If only retaliation is possible, not defense, and arms are no longer an effective policy tool, what then is the military's effective purpose? This raises an important question. If arms are proving counterproductive and governments are losing their monopoly on defense, what then becomes the core purpose and responsibility of a state in securing its people and interests in this evolving global landscape?
That's a profound thought that challenges the very foundation of state power. So if the old tools of state power like military might are proving counterproductive and global economics are shifting, what does this mean for the very role of government? Drucker turns his gaze to new forms of power, asking not what government should do, but what it can do in these new realities. For almost 2 centuries, Drucker observes, the hot debate was what government should do. But now the pressing question is what government can do. Government is no longer the sole power center. Developed countries, in a startling reversal of trends since the Middle Ages, have become pluralist again. But these new pluralisms are different. A societal pluralism of apolitical, performance-focused, single-task institutions, and a body politic pluralism of single cause, highly organized minorities that are totally political. These new realities, Drucker stresses, demand new political leadership, and ironically, charisma is now a political death wish.
Indeed. Drucker reminds us of Adam Smith's core argument in Wealth of Nations, that government, by its very nature, cannot run the economy, like an elephant cannot fly. Yet, this fundamental insight was largely forgotten. Even thinkers like Herbert Spencer or F.A. Hayek initially questioned government's legitimacy or its threat to liberty, not its competence to carry out programs. Hayek, almost 50 years later, did come to conclude that the inherent complexity of information prevents government from effectively managing a complex economy.
And it was Drucker himself who first coined the term privatization in his 1969 book, The Age of Discontinuity, anticipating the divestiture of nationalized industries. At the time, the economists dismissed the idea as perfect nonsense. Yet, just 10 years later, Margaret Thatcher began privatizing industries in Britain. And it didn't stop there. French socialists continued the trend, even privatizing the huge state-owned Renault auto company. Communist China adopted privatization as official policy, and New Zealand, under a Labour government, went so far as to privatize its postal service.
This dramatic shift occurred for three key reasons. First, the pervasive failure of government programs and operations since World War II. Second, the dawning realization of the limits to what taxation and spending can actually achieve. And finally, the inherent limits to government's ability to raise revenues. Drucker explains what government can do by looking at 19th century government activities that did work effectively. These were largely monopolies, like postal services or European railways, where Franz Kafka, the novelist, was even a competent administrator for workmen's compensation. Similarly, many of FDR's New Deal programs in the 1930s were successful. The key insight, according to Drucker, is that government functions effectively only if it operates as a monopoly. When faced with competition, it flounders. Governments also struggle to abandon programs even when they've outlived their usefulness or to innovate. Moreover, government programs tend to degenerate if they are given more than one purpose, often due to political pressures like using the U.S. Postal Service for employment rather than solely for mail delivery. They also fail when their basic assumptions change, as seen with workmen's compensation. These are stringent constraints. A government activity must remain a monopoly, not outlive its usefulness, stay narrowly focused on performance, and operate under unchanging assumptions. Violating these rules inevitably leads to politicization and fast degeneration. Drucker distinguishes between soft and hard government programs. Soft programs, those that are specific, limited, have clear objectives, and focus on changing citizen behavior, tend to work. Hard programs, however, which are generalized, have multiple and often conflating objectives and aim for large-scale social change, almost invariably degenerate. Many post-WWII programs fell into this hard category. Similarly, government-owned businesses only succeed as pure moneymakers, but cease to perform once political or social values interfere.
Drucker then makes a powerful argument about what money can't buy. While compassion and protecting the poor are legitimate functions of government, and 19th century programs like public works and schools successfully provided what only the rich could previously afford. The 20th century saw massive government spending aimed at changing the social conditions of the poor. The results, he says, have been uniformly disappointing and in some areas actually made things worse. He cites U.S. low-income housing, often abandoned and worse than the slums it replaced, and welfare, which only led to increasing dependence and paralysis, making the black poor, for example, poorer. In stark contrast, he offers Margaret Thatcher's privatization of English council housing as arguably the most successful government program of the past 40 years. By allowing renters to become owners, it transformed both the spirit and physical appearance of these formerly dilapidated areas into self-respecting communities. So it raises a challenging question for us, the listeners. How long should we maintain programs that are not only unsuccessful, but may actually be causing harm?
He extends this critique to what taxes cannot do. While Oliver Wendell Holmes famously stated, "The power to tax is the power to destroy," a newer idea emerged from German academic socialists, suggesting taxes could be used to reward, redistribute income, and further social justice and economic equality. David Lloyd George implemented this in pre-WWI Britain. However, Drucker points to Vilfredo Pareto's law, which concluded that government cannot effectively change income distribution, only marginally modify it. Therefore, taxes should primarily serve to raise revenue with the fewest possible negative side effects. This brings us to the limits of the fiscal state. Joseph Schumpeter, reflecting on WWI, predicted a new era where governments, no longer constrained by the historical limit of raising only about 5% of national income, would be able to raise far more. This, he warned, would lead to endemic inflation and undermine the political system because policymakers, freed from the necessity of saying no, would be unable to resist demands. This would increasingly divert money from productive spending like investment in wealth-producing facilities and new technology into unproductive government spending aimed at redistributing income.
And Drucker brings up a phenomenon we can still see today, the silent tax revolt. He explains that once the government's take, especially through taxes, exceeds about 35–40% of GNP or personal income, a quiet but highly effective tax revolt begins. People simply stop working as hard, thinking, what's the point if it's all taxed away? More alarmingly, people start to cheat, leading to the growth of a gray economy. In the U.S., it was almost non-existent before 1960, but by Drucker's time, estimates put it as high as 15% of the official economy. Places like Italy and Spain, the gray economy became the truly dynamic one. Attempts to stamp out the gray economy are ineffectual as long as tax rates remain high. And Drucker notes that while people might publicly condemn it, many participate and even consider it morally justified. This, he argues, undermines society's moral cohesion and produces a dangerous political poison. Cynicism. Schumpeter had warned that inflation would destroy free society, but Drucker sees the silent tax revolt as an equally corrosive poison, albeit a slow one. He asks if we are nearing the end of the spending state, given that politicians now know their promises are often no longer believed. The future, he suggests, requires accepting these limitations, budgeting based on available resources, and learning to say no, risky and unpopular decisions, but what politicians are supposed to do. This is where it gets really interesting. Drucker argues that governments have been trying to fly like swallows when they're actually elephants, and when they push too hard, society pushes back, not with a roar, but with a quiet, pervasive tax revolt.
This leads directly into Drucker's discussion of the new pluralisms. He observes that in developed non-communist countries, both society and polity have become pluralist, but in fundamentally new ways. Theory still assumes government is the sole organized power center, but new, separate power centers are everywhere. He identifies a societal pluralism characterized by apolitical, performance-focused, single-task institutions like businesses, hospitals, or schools, and a political pluralism composed of single-cause, highly organized minorities, the mass movements that seek power through disciplined action rather than numbers or persuasion. Within societal pluralism, Drucker highlights a significant shift. A century ago, most babies were born at home, and 3/4 of production came from small family farms or businesses with fewer than 5 people. Now, almost all births are in hospitals, and 3/4 of production comes from businesses employing at least 25 people. These are all single-purpose institutions, not government or political entities, yet each requires its own management and economy to perform. He stresses that legal independence versus state ownership makes little difference to their performance. This also represents a profound shift in the workforce. A century ago, domestic servants were the largest employee group. Now, the vast majority of people in developed countries work in and for an organization. Domestic servants are virtually gone, farmers are a small minority, and the manufacturing worker is shrinking. The new workforce consists of knowledge workers who are employees of organizations. Increasingly, the most highly educated and paid individuals are employees, often spending their entire working lives within organizations. Drucker notes the historical unease with the rise of modern business corporations and the later development of the modern civil service, followed by labor unions, universities, healthcare systems, and the third sector nonprofits, all forming new pluralist institutions.
And these new pluralisms are fundamentally different from earlier forms. Traditional pluralisms, like the king-duke-count hierarchy, were based on power derived from the same source and shared concerns. But the new pluralism is based on function. These new institutions don't encroach on political power like the old ones did. However, they also don't share identical concerns or a common worldview. Instead, they exhibit the tunnel vision of specialists, leading to constant worries about communications, because each institution has its own language, knowledge, career ladder, and values. None sees itself as solely responsible for the whole community.
This complex landscape also impacts individual rights and responsibilities in organizations. Drucker argues that in this new society, neither Jefferson's ideal of independent farmers nor Marx's impoverished proletarians materialized. Instead, we have knowledge employees, neither exploited nor exploiters, collectively owning the means of production through pension funds, dependent yet mobile, and needing access to organizations to be effective. Drucker emphasizes the ancient legal principle of doctrine of the wild animal and institutions are responsible for their impacts regardless of fault. This is the basis for modern liability and environmental lawsuits. This means institutions have a duty and self-interest to limit their impact strictly to what's necessary for their social function. Anything beyond that, Drucker says, is an illegitimate usurpation of power. He illustrates this with American courts, which restrict betraying trade secrets but are reluctant to restrict ex-employees from moving to competitors. He also notes that many benevolent activities, like unions keeping out undesirables or paternalistic companies, often go beyond necessary impacts.
This leads to the debate about community responsibility, whether institutions should solve social problems or simply stick to their narrow function, as Milton Friedman would argue. Drucker's position is that both are right and wrong. Institutions are in the community and cannot retreat, but they must not act beyond their narrow competence or specific function. He gives the example of Julius Rosenwald of Sears Roebuck, who, to ensure a healthy farm community that could buy from Sears, invented and financed the farm agent program until the U.S. government took it over. Drucker argues this was self-interest, not philanthropy. Such community responsibility only works if it fits the institution's competence and value system, acting as an extension, not a diversion.
In terms of individual rights, knowledge workers possess a right to job and mobility. However, these rights must not impair an institution's ability to abandon, retrench, or enforce discipline and performance standards, as seen in the unemployment created by strict employment laws in Belgium and Holland, or the economic backwardness caused by absolute job security in the Soviet Union and China. Drucker stresses that knowledge workers must assume responsibility for their own contribution, directing their knowledge towards institutional objectives, countering the tendency for specialists to be too specialized. Regarding government's role in a pluralist society, Drucker notes that many institutions, like the civil service, healthcare, and education, are heavily government-financed, yet they largely maintain their autonomy and values. Education, healthcare, and productivity, while fundamentally political matters, are often insisted by institutions as being too important for politicians. Government has responsibility, but little direct authority. What government can do, he argues, is set limits, as FDR did for U.S. business and Thatcher did for unions and universities. Ultimately, the most important future task for government in a pluralist society will be to set standards, defining what a country expects from these powerful, autonomous institutions on which national and citizen well-being depend.
And then we get to political pluralism and the alarming rise of single-cause mass movements. These are small, highly organized minorities that try to gain power not through numbers or persuasion, but purely politically. Drucker traces their origins to America, specifically to press barons Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst in the late 19th century. They discovered how to use mass circulation papers to mobilize small, disciplined groups to support or oppose candidates based on a single issue. This American invention was then adapted by the European left, notably Georges Sorel, and then famously by Lenin, Hitler, and Mao, who used it to build their own single-cause, non-compromising movements. In the U.S., the temperance movement, which had failed for decades to gain majority support for prohibition, successfully adopted this strategy, forcing Congress to ban alcohol despite declining popular support. Today, we see modern examples in environmental groups or pro-anti-abortion movements. Their strategies are always the same. No compromise, their single cause is a moral absolute, and they don't aim for majority support. So it's a world where power is no longer concentrated in one place. You have these massive single-purpose institutions, the rise of the knowledge worker, and then these highly focused single-issue groups that don't compromise. This creates a really fascinating and perhaps messy political landscape, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and Drucker ties us into the changing demands on political leadership. He observes a pervasive blandness in political leaders of his time. George Bush, Margaret Thatcher, Francois Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl, who largely eschewed issues and ambitious programs, committing themselves as little as possible. This wasn't about individual personalities, he argues, but a generic phenomenon. Traditional issues, programs, and political alignments simply didn't fit the new realities. Any attempt to offer a detailed program would alienate too many different factions within their voting base. Drucker offers a powerful warning: beware charisma. He contends that the widespread nostalgia for exciting, glamorous politics and charismatic leaders is a political death wish. While the 20th century saw many charismatic leaders, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, Mao, they caused immense damage. What truly matters is leading in the right direction, not charisma. In the complex conditions of the late 20th century and beyond, charismatic leadership could be fatal due to the need for a common vision without the old common creeds. Instead, Drucker highlights that the constructive achievements of the century came from uncharismatic people like Dwight Eisenhower, George Marshall, Konrad Adenauer, and Harry Truman, individuals who were highly disciplined, competent, and often seen as dull, but possessed vision, a deep sense of duty, and a willingness to work hard to achieve results. The new political tasks ahead, Drucker identifies, include navigating the decay of the Russian Empire, understanding the limits and functions of government in a pluralist society besieged by single-cause special interests, and providing leadership for the new majority of knowledge workers in a post-business society. The enemy, he states, is us, meaning traditional politics is simply incapable of handling these challenges. Yet he notes some encouraging precedents, such as the joint action that helped halt Mediterranean pollution among Spain, France, and Italy, or President Reagan's unexpected success in achieving the first real arms cutback, demonstrating a common interest in becoming militarily weaker. Drucker holds an optimistic view that for knowledge workers, old politics makes no sense at all, but proven competence certainly does. This raises an important question. If the traditional models of political leadership and engagement are no longer effective, how then do we find and empower leaders who can navigate these complex, nuanced realities rather than simply appealing to outdated slogans?
That's a critical question for our times. How do we find leaders who aren't just good at campaigning, but are truly effective at governing in this new landscape? Let's shift gears now into part 3, economy, ecology, and economics, new global connectivities. Drucker describes a transnational economy, where traditional factors of production like land and labor are increasingly secondary. Money itself has become transnational and universally obtainable, meaning it no longer offers a competitive advantage. Instead, management has emerged as the decisive factor for competitive position. The goal in this new economy is market maximization, not just profit maximization, and trade increasingly follows investment, becoming a function of it.
Drucker identifies 4 distinct units of economic power in this transnational economy: the traditional national state, the region, like the EEC, North America, and a potential future Far Eastern region around Japan; a genuine and almost autonomous world economy driven by money, credit, and investment flows, organized by information that knows no national boundaries; and finally, the transnational enterprise, which views the entire developed non-communist world as a single market and location for both production and sales. Economic policy in this new reality is no longer just about free trade versus protectionism, but increasingly about reciprocity between these regions. Complementing this, Drucker introduces the concept of a transnational ecology. He asserts that the environment, much like money and information, knows no national boundaries. Crucial needs such as protecting the atmosphere and the world's forests cannot be addressed through national action or adversarial disputes. They demand common, transnationally enforced policies. Awareness of this problem exploded after World War II, with local environmental events having non-local consequences: sulfur emissions from U.S. steel mills causing acid rain in Canada, Rhine effluents poisoning Dutch water, and Chernobyl's radioactive particles affecting Sweden and Scotland.
What's striking is that Drucker emphasizes this threat isn't limited to developed industrialized countries. He points to the destruction of tropical forests by destitute peasants using primitive methods as the greatest impending ecological catastrophe, and notes that even communist countries struggled with severe pollution, refuting the old dogma that pollution was solely a capitalist problem.
This underscores that it's a common task, futile to tackle nationally or adversarially. It requires accepting that environmental damage anywhere is everyone's problem. Economists' traditional view of pollution as externalities, costs borne by the community, is no longer acceptable because it grants a competitive advantage to polluters. It needs to become a direct cost of doing business, much like workmen's compensation internalized the cost of industrial accidents. Drucker suggests solutions like heavy fees on rush hour traffic, spurring substitutes for unsafe substances, and even outright forbidding harmful ones. While environmental action must be local, it needs a common transnational commitment, with developed countries potentially compensating poorer ones for environmental protection costs, seeing it as more productive foreign aid than traditional development aid. He points to the 19th century transnational efforts against slave trade and piracy as a historical precedent for declaring common enemies of humanity. The 20th century's lesson of interdependence, where the victor is not prosperous unless the vanquished recovers, further underlines the need for international law to protect resources and economic ties even in wartime.
This takes our understanding of connectedness to a whole new level, doesn't it? It's not just about what happens in our own economy or environment, but how everything is woven into this complex global tapestry, where national boundaries mean less and less for fundamental challenges.
Moving into the American experience and the paradoxes of economic development, Drucker challenges common perceptions. He points out that while everyone believed American manufacturing collapsed in the early to mid-1980s, U.S. industrial exports actually grew in most years. The real issue underlying the massive trade deficit was not a manufacturing collapse, but the worldwide collapse of commodity prices and exports that began in 1981, falling to their lowest levels ever. By the late 1980s, only Japan and the Soviet Union remained major food markets. India became a food exporter and China was self-sufficient. This meant the dollar was overvalued against raw materials, not manufacturing. After the dollar's free fall against the yen post-1985, raw material prices continued their decline, leading to stable U.S. prices and wages, while countries like Japan saw their food and raw material costs plummet. This presented a paradox. The raw material economy was in a prolonged depression, yet industrial economies were booming. This was partly due to the economy becoming less material intensive. A 1980s microchip used less than 2% raw materials energy compared to 60% for a 1920s car. Japan's industrial production more than doubled between 1965 and 1985 with barely any increase in raw material consumption, and information itself is totally knowledge intensive.
This leads to Drucker's concept of the transnational company. He distinguishes it from the traditional multinational, where a parent company had local daughters producing for foreign markets. In the transnational company, the distinction blurs. Design is done anywhere, production where economics dictate. He gives the example of IBM producing PCs for Europe in 2 locations and disk drives in 1, or a pharmaceutical company doing all its fermentation in 1 Irish plant but selling in 164 countries. Money management is centralized, and top management is transnational. This isn't just about corporate giants. Medium and small businesses are also operating globally, often more easily because they're less politically visible. Leadership in the developed world now operates within a triad of North America, Western Europe, and Japan, meaning any firm in one region potentially competes with any firm in the other 2. He cites GE's strategy of divesting profitable areas where it couldn't be a world leader and expanding where it could. Drucker concludes that even a small Belgian sausage maker increasingly needs to manage as a European business, and firms universally need to think of themselves as transnational to avoid being pushed out of their own home markets.
Crucially, Drucker highlights the symbol economy. He argues that the real economy of goods and services no longer dominates the transnational economy. Instead, the symbol economy of money and credit does. The London interbank market alone turns over 10 to 15 times the amount needed for world trade daily, and foreign exchange markets trade many times more. Over 90% of these transactions serve purely financial functions, driven by their own rationality, largely political, anticipating government decisions on interest rates, exchange rates, taxes, and political risk. The American experience, he notes, clearly shows that this symbol economy largely controls the real economy, as exemplified by Mitterrand's France being forced to reverse course. Because of this, there's no more superpower, no single economic or industrial superpower. Countries compete daily for their world market position, and no country can maintain a long-term competitive lead in technology, management, innovation, or design. The transnational company operates everywhere, with its domicile merely a headquarters or communication center. Instead of individual industrial superpowers, there are now a number of American, German, British, and Japanese companies that collectively form the superpowers in their respective industries worldwide. Managers, Drucker asserts, must base their policies on this new transnational superpower structure.
This brings us to adversarial trade. Drucker explains that the emergence of non-Western trading countries, particularly Japan, created a new form of trade. Unlike complementary trade, a partnership or competitive trade aimed at a customer, adversarial trade aims to dominate an industry by destroying the enemy's capacity. He notes the historical parallel. Just as the English cried foul at American and German competitive trade in the 19th century, the West now cries foul at Japanese adversarial trade. Drucker clarifies this isn't necessarily a deliberate conspiracy, but a reflection of objective needs. The Japanese themselves didn't initially understand it, but protected their home market and focused exports where they were competitive. While protectionism is the wrong answer, making industry less competitive, free trade alone isn't enough either. The solution, Drucker suggests, might lie in economic regions or blocks like the EEC or North American FTA to create the critical mass needed for competitiveness.
This raises an important question. If the very nature of global economics has fundamentally shifted from one of trade in goods to one of financial flows and information, and if a country's economic strength is now less about what it physically produces and more about its knowledge intensity, how then do traditional economic policies and theories even begin to make sense or be effective? Let's delve deeper into the paradoxes of economic development. Drucker notes the initial excitement surrounding economic development, exemplified by Truman's Point 4 and Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, which later turned into a perceived dismal failure. Yet he points to significant successes. The Far East Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan experienced rapid, unexpected growth, transforming from post-war devastation or trading ports into major industrial powers. The northern Mediterranean rim, including Italy, southern France, Spain, and Portugal, transitioned from poverty to major industrial and agricultural regions. The American South, once dirt poor, became affluent. Latin America saw Brazil become the world's 8th largest industrial power, and Mexico heavily industrialized. India, once plagued by famine, developed a 100 million strong educated middle class and achieved food self-sufficiency. Even China, after 2 decades of stagnation, doubled farm production in 5 years after peasants gained some freedom.
But here's the paradox. Development was supposed to eliminate poverty first and fastest, raising the incomes of the poor directly. Instead, it everywhere first produced a new middle class. Only Japan largely eliminated traditional poverty. Drucker says this is much like America in the 1920s, where shocking poverty coexisted with the emergence of a large middle class. The defeat of poverty, he learned, comes at the end, not the beginning, of economic development, and in modern society, poverty is often more social than economic.
He then dissects the failed panaceas. Soviet-style planning, initially touted, proved an abject failure, leading to disdevelopment and problems like explosive bureaucracy, corruption, and inflation. Foreign aid, modeled on the Marshall Plan, also largely failed. Unlike post-WWII Europe and Japan, developing countries lacked the necessary competence and infrastructure. Aid often went to governments, not companies, much of it becoming military aid that hampered economic performance. Economic investment flowed into large prestige projects like steel mills, political showpieces that failed to create the low visibility, dispersed jobs for low-skilled people needed most, which small businesses typically provide. Indicative planning, seemingly successful in Charles de Gaulle's France and Japan Inc., also had mixed results. French indicative planning, after about 10 years, led France to fall rapidly behind non-planning Germany, stifling innovation and exports, and quietly died around 1970, after which French growth began. Japan Inc., while held in awe, saw the Japanese government almost unfailing regularity plan for the wrong targets, pushing industries like steel and opposing the successful development of autos and consumer electronics.
So the policies that did work were dramatically different. They weren't the 19th century model of innovation and technological leadership. The Japanese, for instance, didn't seek tech or scientific leadership. They used imported science and improved others' technology. Drucker identifies 2 policies that did work post-WWII, both previously tried and failed in the 19th century. First, exporting products of low-wage industrial labor. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, this failed because low wage meant low productivity and low quality. But post-WWII, the Japanese realized that training, an American invention, could make low-wage workers highly productive while remaining low-wage. This export-led development became the model for Japan, South Korea, and others. But this strategy is reaching its last gasp as direct labor costs fall below 15% of total cost. The second policy was infant industry protection, pioneered by Henry Clay in the U.S. and Friedrich List in Germany. In the 19th century, this meant closing borders to manufacturing imports, but it never worked. Protected industries became dependent and couldn't export competitively. Mexico, a staunch practitioner this century, saw fast growth, but became less competitive and increasingly reliant on foreign supplies, collapsing when oil prices fell.
The Japanese, however, uniquely combined these 2 failed 19th century policies: low-wage exports and infant industry protection. This gave their industries both high prices and profits from a protected home market and competitive challenge in foreign exchange from the world market. This worked for 30 years for Japan, South Korea, and Brazil, leading to spectacular growth. But, Drucker warns, it inevitably leads to adversarial trade, where developed countries refuse imports from countries they can't export to. The path forward, Drucker concludes, holds tremendous development potential in undoing failed policies, especially communist and social democratic planning. China's farm example, where slightly relaxed controls doubled farm production in 5 years, illustrates this. However, taking these necessary actions will be excruciatingly difficult politically, socially, and economically. Development, he concludes, is not easy, not fast, and first makes poverty more visible. It's about hard work rather than foreign aid. There's no single formula, but its foundations are education and competence, not just capital. It's risky and must be achieved, not simply provided, but success can be achieved.
So Drucker paints a picture of global economic shifts that turned conventional wisdom on its head. The old rules about what makes a nation prosper or what causes development are clearly out the window. So what does work in this new economic reality? It seems to be less about grand theories and more about practical, adaptable strategies.
This leads us to economics at the crossroads. Drucker asserts that no existing economic theory could explain or predict the main economic events of the 15 years between 1975 and 1989. Reality has outgrown existing theories. He notes that similar paradigm shifts happened twice before, in the 1870s with the neoclassicists and marginal utility theory, and after the 1929 Depression, when John Maynard Keynes created a new synthesis. Drucker argues that the existing theories cast the economy as a machinery driven by a few constants. What's needed now is a new economic model that sees the economy as an ecology, an environment, or a configuration of several interacting spheres. The microeconomy of individuals and transnational firms, the macroeconomy of national governments, and the world economy. Soon, he adds, economic regions like the EEC could become a fourth. Each is a partially dependent variable, none fully controls the others, none is fully controlled by them, and none is fully independent. This complexity, he says, can barely be described, cannot be analyzed, and allows of no prediction. The focus, therefore, shifts from curing or managing crises to understanding how the economy resists severe crises.
And Drucker provides a startling list of unexplainable realities from that 1975-1989 period that defy existing economic theory. For example, President Carter pushed the dollar down against the yen to promote exports and create jobs, but despite a record rise in exports, unemployment rose steadily. Even more baffling, during this period of rising unemployment and export boom, dangerous inflation reaching 12–14% annually set in.
To further complicate matters, the dollar prices of raw materials, from wheat and cotton to petroleum and copper, did not go up at all. They actually continued to fall, even though they were already at depression lows in 1985. This meant raw material prices were cut by half for everyone but Americans. And then there's the counterintuitive behavior of Japanese manufacturers. When the dollar dropped, they reacted by maintaining their prices in the U.S., which meant a 50% cut in their own currency for their exports, flying in the face of profit maximization as economists understood it. Drucker explains why theories failed by pointing out that their axiomatic assumptions flew in the face of reality. First, the assumption that the sovereign state controls the economy was flawed. Individuals and firms never submitted to the macroeconomy and successfully sabotaged it. A world economy now exists. Second, the economy as a perfect gas. Keynes' analogy where individual actions are random and without impact, only temperature pressure matter, is a delusion. Individuals and firms do make decisions. Economists might blame confidence when facts don't fit, but even FDR's first administration, which had high confidence, experienced these unexplainable phenomena. Furthermore, the definition of economic rationality as profit maximization failed to account for different time periods. The Japanese maintained sales over short-term profit, maximizing long-term profit-viewing sales in the world market as returns on long-term investment. Finally, contemporary economic theory had no room for technology, innovation, or change. It postulated an unchanging equilibrium, treating technology and innovation as external. Yet these forces, rather than the macroeconomy, are the true masters, capable of rapidly changing the economy.
And the existence of a world economy itself, separate from national economies, but capable of affecting and even controlling them, like it did with Mitterrand's France, poses a new, daunting challenge to economic theory. The economic rationality in the world economy operates on different time periods. Very short for trading currencies, but very long for business decisions. Drucker used the example of U.S. exporters who, with a strong dollar, raised prices, lost sales, and then profitability, versus the Japanese, who learned to maintain market share at the expense of short-term profit, regaining profits in 2 years by seeing sales as long-term investment returns. He also cites George Stigler's research showing that U.S. government regulations designed to control the economy were ineffectual or produced opposite results, a phenomenon now understood as the butterfly effect, small causes having large, unpredictable effects.
This leads to the profound question: can there be economic policy at all? Drucker suggests that the attempt to control the weather of the economy recessions cycles is foredoomed to failure. Economics rose to prominence in the 20th century precisely by promising to control this weather, yet the results have not met the efficacy and safety tests applied to new drugs. While we'll still expect governments to be responsible for the economic weather, Drucker sees a critical shift from weather to climate. He draws an analogy to a physician before antibiotics who focused on maintaining the patient's climate, warmth, fluids, rest, to let the body fight infection, or modern prevention, staying fit, not smoking. Signs of this shift are visible in the growing concern for economic structure, productivity, competitiveness, long-term versus short-term perspectives, industry mix, research, government-business relations, and industrial relations. These concerns have no place in current economic theories or models. They are qualitative, not easily quantifiable, yet they are the determinants of economic reality and decide the wealth of nations. Drucker concludes that, at his time of writing, no theory for this new climate existed. This raises an important question. If the traditional levers of economic policy, like interest rates or taxation, are increasingly unable to predict or control the actual economic weather, what then is the purpose of economic theory, and how should governments effectively guide a national economy in this new, complex global climate?
That's a challenging thought. And it sets the stage perfectly for Part 4, the Knowledge Society, a New World Order, which Drucker calls the post-business society. He sees this as the biggest shift of all, far greater than changes in politics, government, or economics. The social center of gravity has definitively shifted to the knowledge worker. Developed countries are becoming post-business knowledge societies, where university diploma is increasingly the